There's a lot of aspects of the Idaho 4 crime that seem possible, but not probable. There's also a lot of aspects of the Idaho 4 crimes along with this investigation that actually seem rather impossible. Hey everyone, it's Lucky from Unfiltered Lucky, and today I want to talk a little bit about some of the discrepancies and some of the mysteries that are surrounding this Idaho 4 crime and investigation. You know, I think a lot of people have questions and are skeptical of this investigation and the details coming out about these crimes because they simply just don't make sense. They don't add up. So I'm going to start from the beginning and I'm going to work through the timeline just to kind of keep things on track as I go. Now, one of the very first red flags that caught my attention immediately was the 8-hour delay calling 911. This doesn't make sense. This shouldn't make sense to anybody. It was even stated that this baffled law enforcement, that you have two surviving roommates who were in this house while these crimes occurred, and no call to 911 for 8 hours. That raises suspicions. Anybody would be suspicious about that. Now, let's talk about this shoe print that was in front of Dylan's door. Now, this shoe print was described as latent. So this shoe print wasn't visible to the naked eye. It was found using a solution by forensics. So this shoe print had been cleaned up, basically, is what that means. Now, it definitely appeared to be the shoe print of a van's sole. And it had been cleaned up. So it kind of leads us to believe that there was some cleaning going on that morning. Because this was a shoe print composed of body fluid. So somebody stepped in body fluid and stepped in this area in front of Dylan's door. And then that shoe print was cleaned up. So was there people walking around the crime scene and possibly tracking evidence through the house? And then they tried to clean their own shoe prints to try to eliminate those from the crime scene? That would make sense. But it would also mean that they were cleaning up the crime scene. So if this shoe print had been cleaned and it was composed of body fluid, then somebody had to have cleaned it that morning. So what else were they cleaning? Were they trying to eliminate their own footprints or their own traces from the house and started cleaning the crime scene? That seems crazy to me because there's 4 people in this house who bled to death and had their lives taken with a sharp-edged object. But they're cleaning that morning. That just doesn't make sense to me, and I don't feel like that would make sense to a lot of people. one of the great mysteries of this whole thing is this 911 call. Now, we know that the 911 call was made at, we'll say, approximately 11:58 a.m. that morning, 8 hours after they believed that the crimes occurred. The 911 call was placed from inside the house, and it was placed using one of the surviving roommate's phone, but it wasn't the surviving roommate who made the 911 call. Now, the confusing part about this 911 call is that it was a call for a wellness check. The 911 call was made because they believed that one of the roommates had passed out and wasn't waking up. So they called 911 for an unresponsive individual. But how did whoever called 911, how did these people not see that their roommate had lost their lives to a sharp-edged blade with multiple stab wounds in a very gruesome manner? How do they not see this and only call 911 due to an unresponsive person? Why not mention that this person is covered in blood? It just doesn't make sense to me that these students wouldn't recognize immediately why this roommate was unresponsive. That's just never made sense to me. These are college students, not little kids. These are college students. Now, one of the major mysteries to me, and I've mentioned this in previous videos, probably many times, is that this suspect started at the top floor. That shouldn't make sense to anybody. You don't have to be a career criminal or a law enforcement officer to understand how senseless that would be, to start at the top level. That would kind of lead us to believe that, what if Xana and Ethan were the first two victims, and the suspect began on the second floor? It would make more sense that the suspect started on the second floor and then was possibly discovered by somebody on the third floor, and that's why the suspect went to the third floor. That would make more sense to me than the suspect starting on the top floor. So that's really never made sense to me. From the time that was reported, that really created a lot of confusion. Now, during this investigation, when Moscow PD and investigators are following Brian Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra all over Pullman, Washington, and all over Moscow, Idaho, they're following this car almost as if it's driving around in real time, almost as if they're following it in real time. When in reality, if you think about it, they're piecing together pieces and parts of this car, what they believe to be the same car in each video and each image. They believe this to be the same car, but they're following this car between two cities. Think about the reality of that. Think about if you drove a white car and all of the driving that you might do throughout a day, a week, a month, and think about how difficult that would be to track your car all over the city and create a path. Create a path that you drove over a 24-hour period. Simply piecing together videos and photos. That doesn't seem really very realistic. I can understand if this car was maybe more eye-catching rather than a vehicle that is so common. I mean, I feel like you would see this vehicle all over many of these vehicles. But somehow they tracked this vehicle through video footage and still photos. They were able to diagram the path of this vehicle. And they believe that this is the same exact vehicle in every video and every photo. I mean, it's a small town, but that would still be very difficult, especially when you don't have clear footage and the car is such a common vehicle. They said they were looking for over 20,000 of these vehicles. So it would be extremely difficult to know that this is the same white vehicle driving in between two cities. That just never made sense to me. It's also never made sense to me that the only photo they really have is this blurry photo. Or I should say the only photo that they've released. They haven't released a clear photo of Brian Kohberger sitting in his white Hyundai Elantra. I'm not saying it's out there. It's not out there. I'm just saying they haven't released that. Now, one of the issues I had with the statements that Moscow Police Department made immediately after these crimes was that they stated that they definitely believed that this was a targeted attack. That somebody in this house was targeted. Now later they changed that statement to basically say that they weren't sure if it was any person in this house that was targeted, but that it could also possibly be the house that was targeted. But what really caught my attention was when they stated that they didn't believe there was any danger to the public. Now, they have a house full of people who have had their lives taken with a sharp-edged blade. They don't have a suspect. At the time that this statement was made, they had no suspect, and they were still asking questions about witnesses and still asking for information. But they didn't believe that there was any danger to the public. And they stated that to the public. That doesn't make sense. And the only way that does make sense is I would believe that law enforcement came across something, maybe found a piece of evidence, or found something in this house immediately that led them to believe that this was a personal attack towards these individuals. They must have come across something that led them to believe immediately that there was no other threat outside of this house. Now, what that was, we don't know. But to make that statement to the public, I feel like they would have had to have found something right off the bat that led them to believe this. Now, once Bryan Kohberger was arrested and named as the sole suspect, one suspect, that really got confusing. Because it's just kind of hard to believe that one suspect took the lives of 4 victims. Not only took the lives of 4 victims, but this suspect apparently did this within a window of 7 minutes. Entered the house, went to the top level, took the lives of Kaylee and Maddie, struggled with Kaylee, had to fight Kaylee, goes downstairs, takes the life of Ethan and Xana, struggles with them as well, then exits the house, goes to somewhere and apparently ditches these coveralls, gets cleaned up, gets in his car, and drives away in 7 minutes. That doesn't seem possible to me. I mean, does it seem possible as if somebody was training to do something like that? Somebody had experience with these types of crimes? I still believe it would be extremely challenging. I believe that this would be challenging for someone who even had experience committing these types of crimes, let alone somebody who's never committed a violent crime in their life. The times on the timeline, they just don't add up. You know, in the timeline, it states that they believe these crimes occurred between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. But then in the same PCA, they also state that they believe that Bryan Kohberger, that his car, the white Hyundai Elantra, was spotted near the residence at 1122 King Road, driving around at 4:04 a.m. So how was Bryan Kohberger inside the house committing these crimes at 4 a.m. if he was driving around the neighborhood at 4:04 a.m.? So he wasn't even going into the house at 4:04. He was still in his car driving around at 4:04 a.m. This is a short window of time we've been given. Another aspect of this timeline is that they believe that Bryan Kohberger's car is spotted at 4:20 a.m. But they don't believe that the crimes ended until 4:25 a.m. So these times don't match up. 5 minutes doesn't seem like a long time. In the grand scheme of things, 5 minutes is 5 minutes. But 5 minutes is a long time. That's 20% of the timeline that we've been given. That's a lot of time. So these times, they don't match up. It was also stated that in the beginning that they believed that these crimes occurred at 3 a.m. And then the time was moved until 4 a.m. So was the time moved from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. because 4 a.m. was the time when Bryan Kohberger's car was allegedly spotted around this house? Now, in the very, very beginning, it was reported that the crimes could have possibly started at 2 a.m. So now we've gone from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. So there's a 2-hour discrepancy in the times that these crimes began. So that just doesn't make sense to me, that Bryan Kohberger is apparently in 2 different places at once. Now, one of the aspects of the evidence that doesn't make sense to me is this knife sheath. Now, we can speculate and guess about how this knife sheath ended up on the bed. But one thing that I would think most people would be curious about would be, how was this small amount of touch DNA contained to just the button snap on this knife sheath? Now, this knife sheath would have been covered in body fluid. This house would have been covered in body fluid. The way that these crimes are being reported kind of makes it sound like it was nice and tidy. It was nice and neat. The roommates woke up, they're not seeing this horrific crime scene that's right in front of them. This knife sheath is just laying on the bed, perfectly preserved for investigators. But this crime scene was nitty-gritty. Crimes like this are nitty-gritty. They're not nice and neat. They're dirty. These crime scenes are nitty-gritty. So this knife sheath would have been covered in body fluid. If this knife sheath was found where they say that it was found, and I believe that it was, it would be covered in body fluid. But yet they managed to isolate a teeny tiny amount of DNA on the button snap. That doesn't make sense to me, because I feel like there was probably DNA all over this house. This was a party house. So there had to be DNA all over this house. But somehow we've narrowed it down through a very small amount of touch DNA on the button snap of this knife sheath. So, for me, I believe that is why there's so many questions about these crimes. Because the reporting that we're getting, the information that we're receiving from investigators, it doesn't make sense. The witness statements don't make sense. The crime scene doesn't make sense. The timeline doesn't make sense. There's a lot about these crimes that simply don't make sense. Now, is it possible that that these aspects are not making sense on purpose? Is it possible that we're being misled? And that's the reason that a lot of these reports and statements simply don't add up? I guess we really won't know that until the evidence begins coming out in this trial, which I'm not really even sure how confident I am about the evidence that's going to come out in this trial, because it doesn't appear to be coming out in discovery. The prosecution appears, I'm not saying this is what's happening, but the prosecution appears to either be holding on to evidence, or they just simply don't have this evidence. Many people will say that they turned over tons of evidence, that they turned over 20,000 pages of evidence, that they've turned over all of this video footage, they've turned over all of these photographs. But we don't know what's in those 20,000 pages. It could be 20,000 pages of BS. It could be hours and hours and hours of video that's not even distinguishable. It could be hundreds, thousands of photos that aren't distinguishable, that aren't clear. So we don't really know. And hopefully this will begin coming out in the trial, because there's a lot of aspects of this crime and this investigation that just don't make sense. And that's what's making people skeptical. That's what's raising red flags for people, is because what you're hearing is not adding up with your common sense. So hopefully we'll find out more information in this trial, and some questions will be answered about some of this information that really does just seem so off the wall that it doesn't make sense at all. It defies logic. So hopefully we'll get that information when the trial comes out. And hopefully we'll still be getting these little pieces of information that keep being dropped in the media and by witnesses. Stay tuned for my next video, and please like and subscribe to my channel. We're going to cover a lot of different aspects of these crimes, and I'm really approaching this with a very open mind. I'm not biased in any way towards this suspect or any suspect. I'm just following the information, and the information isn't adding up. We'll see you next time.